Alright, so opening up the file I provided for you, the simple crate, is going to look like this. Overall, there's nothing too special about it. Yours is going to be expanded just a little bit over here, but really I just collapsed the special chamfer and the edit poly that are on the ones you guys will open up. Now, while there are a couple options you can change in there, for the most part, we kind of just need something real simple like this. But what we're going to do with it is go ahead and take something simple for an object like this and go ahead and throw on some materials to it to make it look like a good background object. Now, when I say background object, I'm talking more so about things that aren't necessarily going to be directly interacted with in a scene, but something more or less to fill up space. What that means further is we don't need to worry about making everything perfectly textured with this. We just need to get the right feel for it. Plus, this will also give us a good look into doing some additional things. So what we're going to do is go ahead and open up, actually first, our render setup. Because for this, we're going to jump away from Scanline and we're going to move into Art for just a little bit. So with Art being the active one in here, I'm going to go ahead and open up my material editor. So now, because I made that change, we can now have access to a lot of these other different tools. Now, for us, we're going to make and work with this little crate. Well, I have one other change. You know what, I'll come back to that. For this, let's go ahead and drag this one over, this Autodesk Hardwood. Now, all these ones that say Autodesk, these are fairly simple pre-generated maps. They're not the best. At least by default they're not, but a lot can go into them to help out all of what they do for this. So, with my object selected, I'm going to right click, assign the material, or I can hit the buttons up there, or drag out my little line, however you want to go about it. But when we drop it on, we see something that looks like this. And it doesn't look great, but maybe it'll look better when it renders. But I'll give you a hint, it won't. So we have this. Okay. So obviously this doesn't look good. If this was a crate in a game, we'd be talking something, you know, early PlayStation 1. So not great. So let's go ahead and go back into our material editor and see what we can do. Well, there's two issues with everything so far. Number one, I'm going to go ahead and go into my options here. And just to make things simple, I'm going to go ahead and choose this one. And I'm just going to hit delete on the keyboard to get rid of it and replace it with this input. Okay, I'll just keep things even. Now I'll actually go into this material, double click on it, and I can see everything that's going on. Well, the first thing that catches my eye is this, scale. Currently it's 39 and 39. Which means, from its original size, it is much, much bigger. So we need to drop this down. So I'm going to drop both of these to a 1. Now, the program may take just a moment to get everything going in with it. So, I'm going to go ahead and hit render and let's see what we got. Okay. Well, also, I'm going to have high quality turned on just so I can see a little bit easier in this view. But when I render it, it's not really good. So what we need to do is take a look at how this thing is set up based on the way this object was made. Essentially, things were inset and then extruded inward to create these little lips for theoretically where, you know, the different bits of wood would be. Because we did that, this needs a little bit of extra help. It needs help in terms of unwrapping a UV map. So under the modifiers, I'm going to choose Unwrap UVW. And you'll see that everything kind of turns green, or at least some of the borders do. With this and these new options, I'm going to come here to this, Edit UVs. Because Edit UVs gives us access to open the UV editor. So let's see what the UV mapping looks like on this thing. So not great, because I see nothing except just some of these border edges if we zoom into it. For those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with it, Unwrap UVW is essentially how we're going to lay out everything. For me, I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to drop down and choose this, just the wild cherry. So we can see kind of how all the UVs are laying on top of it. The thing is, all of these edges here, these polygons, are reading the data in this very skewed and not necessarily good manner. So we're going to make this kind of simple, and I'm going to choose my polygon down here, if it's not already active, and select everything. I'm going to move this over to the side, and we can see that all the different polygons are selected, which is exactly what we want. Now, this goes into far more detail, but just for our initial taking a look at it, I'm going to do this. I'm going to come up to Mapping with everything selected and choose Flatten Mapping. Now, here I get this little pop-up. Well, I'm just going to say OK, but all of these settings in here change things drastically. But for the most part, I just need to worry about this. So now that I flattened it, it's going to do its best based on this initial setting here. Mostly this option is this setting, the 45. It's going to lay things out as best as it can. Now, I have the ability to choose these polygons and move them around. However, if I do, it's going to let things stretch a little bit based on how it's trying to make these selection methods. So I'm going to go ahead and just undo back a bit on mine and keep it this way for now. Okay, well already I can see this looks much better. Doesn't necessarily look great, but it looks much better. So I'm going to hit render. Okay, so not bad actually. Pretty good overall for just a simple box texture, but we can do a little bit better. To do better, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my material editor, and I can choose a couple things. Well, first off, I have scale, and I could change these to be different amounts for how much I want it to be on there. In this case, smaller amounts, smaller sections of it. It'll repeat more times, which can be a little counterintuitive. So maybe 0.1 isn't where I want to go. Let's try a 2. Just increase things a little bit. And in my display this might look a little rough, but some of that's just going to be the program display. Because when I render it, it doesn't have the weird stretchy, or at least not quite as much as it looks like it does over here. So I can go back through, I'll try a 1.5, 1.5. And side note, if you type in the number, pressing enter in between will help it update faster. Okay, so 1.5, not too bad. Actually, that's pretty good. Next up, I have some of these other options, where I can do things like blur a little bit. So I'm going to set the blur to a 1, and hit render. And let's just see how it changes things. I'll move it over here. Alright, nothing too crazy there. Let's try 0.5. And it's very, very subtle, but the blur can change a lot on the maps. Yeah, I'm not seeing too much of a different result, so that's probably about all I'm really going to get off of this. However, if we look at the material, at least in my mind, this isn't quite what I think of when I think of what a crate looks like. At least to me, I see something a little bit more grainy, maybe a little bit more, maybe something just a little bit brighter. Just something not quite like this. So what I'm going to do is choose this, under Source. Now here's where I said we're not going to use materials and textures outside of the program, because 3ds Max has its own built-in textures. So by choosing Source here, this is going to let us take a look at all these different preset ones. And we can go through and take a look at all these different materials that are in this category that it thinks might work for us. Now, there's a bunch of them in here where we have everything from basic woods at the bottom woods, plastics, and so on. And we can kind of go through and choose which ones we might want to try. And as I go through, I might be able to find ones that fit a little bit more closely to what I have in my mind. So I'm going to choose this one, because this looks pretty good. Maybe I like that one, but I'm going to go with this one for now. And I'm going to just say open. So I do, it'll update. Here in the viewport we see it updated, and let's render and see how it looks. So that's a lot more like what I think of if I think about just a chunk of wood for a crate. And I can go through and I can continue to play with things. Now, these are the options in here. If I go back here, I get some other ones, where I can choose things like relief pattern, where this, in terms of this program, is going to be basically a bump map. So I increase the bump, and that's probably a little bit overboard. So I'll lower that. That looks much better, but it seems like the grain's backwards. So I'm going to go the other direction, and I'm going to go to about a 1.75. I'll hit it again. Okay, all the little grooves are going into it. That might be a little much, so let's try 1.25. Not bad. Not bad, a little bit better. Maybe I'll cut it back just a little bit, try a 1. And just to see what it looks like, I'm going to go with like a 0.25. Just a very subtle indentation. Alright, and not too bad. I am getting a little bit of these little fireflies. And this is something that's inside the renderer, but we'll talk about that just a little bit later. But these little things, these little pixel-looking things, don't worry, it is indeed just how the render is in terms of quality and accuracy. So we'll ignore that part for now. That said, through here, we get all these extra options that we can go through and change for it. Whether we want the box to, be a little bit glossy. In this case, that's a little bit much. So I'll bring this a little bit more yellow. And that's probably too much, so I'm going to ignore the stain for now. Yep. Now if we make it glossy, something like that, it's going to make these fireflies a little bit worse just because there's more light that it's trying to calculate. But I can change it to some other little options that can kind of help refine out some of these little details. And every little thing I do will change it. Now, we have all this, but I can go back in here, and I can change a little bit. I could choose to rotate it, which rotating may not be bad. Actually, you know what? Yeah. So rotating it roughly 45 degrees will give it a much more fluid appearance, though some of the seams on here can be a little rough. But when we face issues like that, we actually can do this. And what I'm going to do is select these 4 polygons. Now, because of the little curve I put in there, we get away with a lot more stuff. But by selecting just the ones I want to change going into the UV editor, I'm going to take this and I'm going to move it just the slightest bit. Okay. Now, in doing so, you'll see that these different edges can now displace from each other. But we can do more than even that. Open it back up. I'm going to hit undo to reselect all of those. And what I could do is choose rotate, use my rotate angled snaps, and rotate this thing roughly 90 degrees. So now I get the wood going, and it might line up here and there on those edges just a little bit, but like with right there, seems like these 2 spots are going to each other a little bit close, but it does displace enough of it that it's pretty good. That said, if I wanted to just kind of continue doing this, I could grab it and actually just leave it off by just a little bit. And if I do, it'll change the angle for this. So these are just some of the little ways we can make simple objects using preset and built-in tools to go through and just increase and change a little bit of these details just to help everything settle in real quick for some of these background objects. So I'm going to go ahead and call that good for this one. On the next video, we will go in and take a look using the same thing at the render setup just to increase our quality a little bit.